Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone in our audience, wherever you are in the world today. I'm Doug Silliman, president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all today to today's program, which will ask the question, how has the invasion of Ukraine reshaped Russia's influence in the Middle East? But before we start our program, I'd like to give those of you in our audience a bit of background on how this program came together. This webinar is the latest in a series of collaborative workshops between the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and the National Security Studies Center at the University of Haifa. The collaboration was born out of the Abraham Accords and is an attempt to bring Gulf Arab voices to Israel and Israeli voices to the Arab Gulf states. And over the past year, we have conducted a series of workshops on a number of topics covering both the opportunities and the difficulties inherent in the implementation of the Abraham Accords on topics that touch the entire region in general and looked at ways to help improve relations between Israel and the Arab world. And we at AGSIW are grateful for the collaboration of everyone at the University of Haifa, but want to particularly thank Professor Benny Miller, the head of the National Security Studies Center at Haifa University, who has helped make this partnership possible. So Benny, would you like to say a few words of introduction this morning?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ambassador Silliman. And first of all, let me thank you personally, I think, for your allowing us and enabling and encouraging us for going to this collaboration, which I think is extremely successful and very effective. I also would like to thank Raymond and Bushara for the great technical, administrative, and all the other elements of collaboration. Also would like to thank Dr. Moran Zaga from Haifa, who was also very helpful, and Rakefet Diamond from the University of Haifa, both of them extremely helpful and always willing to collaborate and to make contribution. We had a number of workshops, and I think we covered some of the key issues related to the Abraham Accords and to the geopolitics of the Middle East, which, as we all know, is quite complicated and things are always in transition, but still, we try to look for the fundamentals, for the sources, for the patterns, for the effects of recent changes, which are very remarkable. We looked at the United States in the Middle East, and the question, is there still American hegemony, unipolarity, American dominance, leadership, or maybe there are some changes in this respect? We also looked at China in the Middle East and its rising role. Today we look at Russia, so these are the great powers that we covered. We also covered the Palestinian issue. We covered some of the Gulf issues. And we also looked more broadly at conceptual, theoretical elements of the geopolitics of the Middle East from competing perspectives. And I would like to thank Professor Greg Goes for his great contribution. He's one of the leading scholars of the Middle East, and I really appreciate his participation and contribution to the workshop. And looking forward, hopefully, for future collaboration and cooperation. I think it's very important, at least from our perspective and from the Israeli attempts to integrate into the Middle East with all the challenges and the difficulties. But I think we made a very modest, extremely very modest contribution to that. And if we achieved even a slight of that contribution, then I think we are very proud. And again, Ambassador Doug Silliman, if I may call you Doug, I think I really appreciate your leadership and your making it all possible. And it really was so nice to work with you, and I really appreciate it. Thank you very much, and looking forward to our workshop today.
Well, Dr. Miller, Benny, thank you very much. So let's get down to business. With the patting on the shoulder for having had a good year of collaboration coming to an end, we want to move to the main event. And I'd like to present the moderator for today's discussion, the Executive Vice President of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, Ambassador William Roebuck. Bill retired from the U.S. Foreign Service last year after 3 decades of service that culminated as the U.S. Ambassador to Bahrain and the Deputy Special Envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS, with a good portion of that time spent in eastern Syria. He earlier in his career served as the U.S. Charge d'Affaires in Tripoli, Libya, also in Baghdad, in Damascus, and in Tel Aviv. And as part of ancient history, Bill and I went through Arabic language classes together at the Foreign Service Institute in the deep, dark past. So, Bill, I will hand you the microphone. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Professor Miller. Appreciate the review of our collaboration over the past year. I think we've had a very good working relationship, and I look forward to continuing it. I want to welcome everyone. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists this morning, and then we'll kick off our discussion with them. There'll be time for questions, as Doug noted at the end, and just reemphasize audience members should use their Q&A function to tee those questions up. Let me get started with introducing our panelists, and then we'll begin our discussion. Dr. Anna Borshchevskaya is a senior fellow in the Washington Institute's Diane and Guilford Glazer Foundation program on Great Power Competition in Middle East, and she focuses on Russia's policy toward Middle East. In addition, she's a contributor to Oxford Analytica. She was previously with the Atlantic Council and the Peterson Institute. Her analysis has been published widely in publications such as Foreign Affairs, The Hill, The New Criterion, and Middle East Quarterly, as well as peer-reviewed journals. She's the author of the 2021 book, Putin's War in Syria, Russian Foreign Policy, and the Price of America's Absence. Anna holds a doctorate from George Mason University. Dr. Li-Chen is an assistant professor at Khalifa University in the UAE. She's a specialist in political economy of Russian and Gulf energy and its intersection with international relations. Her most recently published books include Low Carbon Energy in the Middle East and North Africa, and External Powers and the Gulf Monarchies. Her articles have appeared in leading academic journals, such as Russian Review, Cambridge Review of International Affairs, and Energy Research and Social Science, as well as in popular media like the South China Morning Post and Al Monitor. She's active on the speaking circuit as well, having been a guest at Chatham House, the National University of Singapore's Middle East Institute, and the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research. Dr. Alexander Tabachnik is a senior fellow at the Center for Cyber Law and Policy at the University of Haifa. He recently completed his thesis at the School of Political Sciences, University of Haifa, under the supervision of Professor Miller. His main research interests concern the identity formation process, information warfare in cyberspace, and the interrelation between technology and security in the regulation of cyberspace. As a research fellow at the Center for Cyber Law and Policy, he focuses on Russian information warfare in cyberspace. I thought it might be useful to establish in a baseline really for Russian influence in the Gulf and the broader Middle East pre-February 24, the beginning of the Ukraine invasion, in order to get at how much impact that military action by Russia has shaped or reshaped its influence and the region. Anna, let me start with you. You've written about this extensively in your great book on Putin's war in Syria. Could you just give us a sense of the traditional Russian foreign policy goals for the Middle East?
Sure, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. I want to start with just a very brief overall broad historical comment, and that is that for most of its existence as an independent state, Russia wanted to have influence in the Middle East region, and that of course includes the Gulf as well, but the broader Middle East as well. And those interests were multiple. They were first and foremost geopolitical. in a sense that Russia, again, from its inception, began competing with Western powers, and geographically, geopolitically, the Middle East was an important arena of that competition. As a traditional land power, the Russian state sought warm water ports, and in that sense, the Eastern Mediterranean, but also even looking further down. I mean, Peter the Great dreamt of Russian influence as far as the Red Sea. So simply from access to strategic waterways, the Middle East was a very important area of Russian interest, but also religiously and culturally as well, because the Russian state developed in direct proximity to the Middle East, and in fact, its very identity was shaped by Middle East. And again, if you think about the wider Middle East and the Muslim world more broadly, including the peoples that the Russian state conquered as the Russian state expanded, of course, oftentimes, again, going back to geopolitical competition, which is probably the primary area of our discussion here today, geopolitically, this was always an arena of great power competition where Russia played an important role, and it tended to be zero-sum. In other words, for Russia to win, the West had to lose. That was certainly the case with the Soviet Union's competition, and it's certainly the case with Vladimir Putin's Russia as well. One important change from the Soviet approach to how we saw Putin's approach evolve, and this brings us more to the present, is that Vladimir Putin sought to build, is how Putin went about gaining this influence. In other words, goals themselves, but how the state pursued those goals had evolved based on lessons learned from Soviet failures, even from Tsarist failures, mostly from Soviet failures, however. And so Putin's particular hallmark approach, it's really Yevgeny Primakov's approach that Putin had implemented. Yevgeny Primakov, of course, was, amongst others, Russian foreign affairs minister in the late 1990s, also had an extensive history in its Soviet intelligence. He was a skilled Arabist, and he in particular believed Russia needed to play an important role in the Middle East. So with that in mind, Putin took a flexible approach, that is Primakov's vision of building contacts with all major players in the region, building contacts with both governments and opposition movements to them. And that really has been a consistent approach from 2000 till the Ukraine invasion, and really remains the case to this day.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna, for that good laydown. Li-Chen, I want to go to you next. And taking off from Anna's remarks that focused primarily on the past and Russia's move to current influence, could you give us a sense of what you think are the primary indicators today? Right now, let's say pre-February 24, what are the primary indicators of Russia's influence in the Gulf and the broader Middle East?
I'll be glad to, Bill. So if you wanted to track Russia's influence or to measure Russia's influence in the Middle East, I would suggest that you look very roughly at, say, 5 key areas. One of them is trade and investment, right? And very briefly, if we look at that, you would find that there has been an increase in trade from something like 55 billion today, from 35 billion in 2010. So that's a jump. But of course, half of this is actually with Turkey, right? Which means that with the rest of MENA, it's not really huge. So in terms of trade investment, Russia is not a great, trade and commercial or FDI partner. It's not, for example, comparable to China. If we look at a second indicator of influence, that would be in the security field. So the most obvious one to look at would be arms or weapons sales. And that, again, we can see that around 40% of Russia's revenue from arms sales actually comes from the MENA region. So that's quite a large sum. And Russia is the second largest arms supplier to the MENA countries. Apart from weapons sales in security area, of course, we can look at military drills and exercises, which Russia conducts with Iran and Egypt, for example. And it's also got bases, right, in Syria. So far, that's its only base. And it has tried to get several more bases in Sudan and Morocco, but there's question marks over these bases. So far, it's just Syria. But all this has been an improvement from 2000, let's say. If we wanted to look at a third indicator, we'd go to say the political diplomacy field. Russia has made great strides in terms of bilateral relations, signing a number of strategic partnerships in the region with UAE, Saudi Arabia, Algeria. It also has created a lot of multilateral forums where it can speak to different audiences in the Gulf, like the Russia-Arab Cooperation Forum or the GCC-Russia dialogue. So it's got that platform to increase its visibility. Russia, unlike in the past, say from the early 2000s, it has also appointed special representatives to the region, whether it's for Middle East peace process or for Syrian reconciliation. So if we use that measure, again, I think it's been quite successful in upping its influence since, let's say, 2000. A couple more areas to touch if you want us to track their influence. Next one would be people-to-people indicators. So if you looked at that, again, I think you would see a lot more Russian influence in that sense, people to people in terms of Russian tourists, in terms of Russia's Arabic language media influence in MENA, in terms of its equivalent to the Confucius Institute or the Alliance Française. It's got a Rousseau through the Chefstable organizations. I think it's about 11 of them in MENA. So if we look at, again, these indicators, you'll find that Russia has really reached out on a people-to-people level. And finally, of course, if we look at energy as the final indicator, again, Russia has never been part of the OPEC grouping, but now it has, been a part of the OPEC Plus, and it has been very successful despite earlier misgivings about its longevity. And it's not just about oil, but Russia has been very active in the nuclear power markets in the Middle East. In Egypt and Turkey. We can talk about that later if you want. But also in terms of gas to Turkey, for example, or even helping to increase oil production in Iraq through Lukoil, for example. So I say all in all, I think if we look at some of these indicators, we'll see that if we use a baseline of, say, the first decade of the 2000s, you'll see that Russia today is a much more influential actor.
Thank you, Li-Chen. Alex, taking off a bit from the point Li-Chen made about Russia, an aspect of Russia's economic influence and activity in the Middle East, some have argued that Russia's ability to have influence in the Middle East before the Ukraine invasion, that it was limited by its small toolkit, and particularly by its relatively small economic clout compared to the economies, the GDP size of the US, China, and the EU. I wonder if you agree with that that broad assessment that about Russia's relations pre-Ukraine invasion, that it was limited so significantly by its economic clout, or has it found ways around that?
Thank you very much for this question. Generally, I agree with this statement. Moreover, I must say that I'm sure people understand it, that Russia is declining power. For example, from economic perspective, from demographic perspective, from even the military, conventional military perspective. But anyway, I would like to separate my answer in two parts. As I said, I agree with this statement. I think that Russia indeed has relatively low capability to shape outcomes of the Middle East region. And first of all, I want to point your attention that Russian GDP comprised before this war in Ukraine just 7% of the American GDP, and if we compare American GDP and EU GDP in Russia, as Russian GDP are just about 4%. This almost nothing in comparison with the collective West. At the same time, Russia is characterized by lack of advanced technologies and low efficacy of its economy. Russia also, I think, characterized by very low technologies, low efficacy economy, as I said, and also Russia's conventional army capability were under question. I think that they definitely improved since the Georgian war, but it was difficult to assess Russia's real military capability, especially considering corruption in the Russian security services, including, of course, in army. Also, Russia's trade with the Gulf countries was relatively limited, just several percent of Russia's foreign trade. So from the economic perspective, Russia's influence was relatively limited. Of course, if we compare this data with China or with European Union or of course with United States. However, this fact of very low economic and military Russian conventional potential was balanced to some extent by the American pivot to the east, less dependence from fuel from the Middle East, American pressure for democratization and liberalization of the Gulf countries, and the general American willingness to reduce their presence in the Middle East region. That means to downscale American presence in Iraq, Syria, and Kuwait from Afghanistan. Especially was problematic retreat from Afghanistan. I think this influenced significantly a Russian will to intervene in Ukraine later. Also, American willingness to support a war against Houthis in Yemen and provide response for all security needs of the Gulf countries in the face of Iranian threat also undermined the relationship between the United States and the Gulf countries. The US is seen as less reliable security provider in the past, and overall American dominance in the international system is in decline, as is seen also from the Middle East. All these factors influence, from my perspective, on the relationship between the key Gulf countries and Russia, not because of Russian strength, but because of the American unwillingness to intervene in the Middle East. In other words, American will to gradually reduce its presence in the Middle East influenced Russian position in the regions to a greatest extent. For example, Russia is seen as an additional power, opportunistic power, which can be used as a bargaining tool and opportunity to avenge for the United States previous distancing from the Saudi Arabia and Emirati security concerns. Russia also was found as a useful partner in the framework of OPEC+, which helps to sustain high energy prices. Was very good also for Russia and also for the Gulf countries. Also, Russia was perceived as an additional source of provision of goods and fertilizers for the Middle East countries. For example, Russia provides about 50% of all grains for the Middle Eastern countries. Russia and Ukraine, but Russia about 37%. So it's very significant influence. Mm. Also, due to Russia's relatively success in Syria war and capability to influence to some extent on Iran and in proxies, Russia has been perceived as additional elements that may help to sustain security situation in the Middle Eastern region. At the same time, the Gulf countries have not supported the anti-Russian sanctions imposed on Russia following the 2014 intervention in Ukraine, while Russia was perceived as a more flexible player who does not ask questions about democracy, human rights, transparency, as the Western countries do. Russia also rejects color revolution, supports the existing state structure and governments, both external and against external intervention and internal intervention. In this field, Russia and the Gulf countries found a mutual interest. However, this is my point. It should be underlined that Russia's growing presence in the Gulf countries region prior to the war in Ukraine was possible because the Gulf countries were allowed this process, and not because Russia was able to impose its will on the Gulf countries. And I think this is not long-term strategy, but rather opportunistic development that was useful for the involved sides. That is all.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. I'm interested now in heading into the real meat of our discussion, which is the impact on Russia's capabilities and influence in the region since the launch of its attack on the Ukraine I mean, clearly Russia's defense industrial base, as well as its prestige, had been or seemed to have been severely degraded by the effects of the Ukraine war, whether it's battlefield losses, perceptions about weak performance of its personnel, and failings in logistics, weaponry, tactics, etc., as well as the continuing longer-term impact of sanctions. It's really suffered a blow. I wonder, Alex, if you would just give us your quick sense of the impact of the Ukraine on Russia's influence in the Middle East, and we'll give maybe the others a chance to also give a quick observation to kick things off.
Yes, I think that the Russian military influence on the Middle East almost was not damaged because it was also previously limited. I think that Russian influence in the Middle East is mostly political through regulation of oil prices and supplies of foods and fertilizers. And I think that we can see another very dangerous development because of maybe future Russian weakness. We will see Iranian strengthening in the region. This is my answer.
Thank you, Alex. Anna, over to you. In your assessment, does Russia still look like a reliable security partner and partner in other ways to Gulf and Middle East, broader Middle East leaders? Or does it look more like as some U.S. analysts and others want it to look and appear as a pariah?
Yeah, I agree with Alexander in that, I mean, broadly speaking, at least at this stage where we are right now, Russia's overall prestige has not really been damaged in the Middle East. And certainly when it comes to the Gulf as well. And here's what's important to understand. The region, including the Gulf region, but also the rest of the region as well, looks at Ukraine very differently than we do in the West, where we see, rightly so, an act of just completely naked aggression against a peaceful and smaller neighbor on the part of Russia, but also even beyond that, the broader implications for the rules-based global order that this invasion pretends. From the region's perspective, things are just a little bit more gray. They're not as black and white. And this is particularly, I think, true of the Gulf region. And yes, by and large, these states disapprove of Russia using force. But if you dig a little bit deeper and ask about how they perceive NATO and NATO enlargement and Russia-Ukraine relations and what role the West played in them, rather than see things from our perspective, they often tend to perceive us as hypocritical. And again, this is that's not something that I agree with, but the region's perception, right? They think that we weren't quick enough to help them when in situations that they perceived as similar. For example, when it came to Saudi Arabia and the Houthis, we tend to have a double standard. The way we use sanctions from their perspective, is also inconsistent. So it also, and this is critically important, the region does not know how the war is going to end. I mean, the fact of the matter is, none of us really knows how the war is going to end. And so when the Gulf region looks at the war in Ukraine and thinks about Russia, they continue to see Russia as a permanent fixture of global politics, and they don't want to choose between simply us and other Russia or China, for that matter.
Thanks, Anna. That's a great answer. There's a lot of to unpack there. We may come back to some of the observations that you've made. Li-Chen, I wanted to ask you about the impact of influence on the UAE and Saudi Arabia of their agency in dealing with Russia. I think what I've read from some analysts is that they already had significant agency in shaping how Russia could deal with them and where they could limit Russian influence in the region. I just wonder if, from your perspective, the Ukraine crisis has enhanced that agency with some of the Gulf countries. And is that also true in the broader Middle East, or is it less true there?
Sorry, Bill, my internet went off for just a couple of seconds. Was that question for me?
Yeah.
So could you repeat that? Just summarize that.
Sorry. So in terms of agency for UAE and Saudi, there are analysts who argue that those countries already had significant agency in shaping Russian influence in the region, especially with them, and that the Ukrainian crisis is actually going to enhance their leverage, so to speak, in dealing with Russia. Do you think that assessment is true, or is it more really a status quo situation along the lines of what Anna and Alexander have both already assessed?
All right. First off, let me respond to Alex's analysis when he said that there would be basically no change in Russia's military standing in the eyes of the Middle East. Well, I agree that now, everybody's taking a wait and see outcome. I do think that there are some risks, not so much for the Gulf states, but I think for those countries in North Africa that buy quite a number of arms from Russia, right? So that would be like Algeria, that would be Egypt, and that would be even Iraq, right? They buy a fair share of Russian arms. And I think that they'll be looking at it and thinking, wow, okay, if Russian tanks can get their turrets, self-combustion blown off because of technical flaws, then I'm not sure you still want to actually buy Russian equipment. And would Russia still be able to supply that kind of equipment post-Ukraine, whenever that is? Because Russia will need to replenish its own supplies first, before being able to export some of these weapons to their customers. So I think that in the near future, there could be these questions asked by some of these customers, not necessarily by the Gulf states, because they don't really buy much Russian weaponry. With regards to your question on whether Russia, about the Gulf leverage over Russia, I don't think that leverage is very strong. I think they would like to think that it is quite strong. The Gulf states would like to think that they could induce, Russian cooperation or at least alignment by perhaps dangling investments, for example, which they have done traditionally. And I think that's going to get harder to do in Russia because of, all kinds of sanctions issues, particularly if there are secondary sanctions. So I think that's going to be harder. But I think where the leverage would be is actually against the United States, right? So the Gulf states would say, hey, look, I can continue dealing with Russia. I can continue to, talk with it about OPEC plus. I could make investments in Russia. Russia could make investments in me, etc. So how about you going, a little easy on me with regards to some of my requests for, I don't know, weapon sales or things like that. So I think that leverage is actually using it's a bargaining chip, right? Signaling their relations to the US. And saying, look, I've got Russia in my, as a friend. So I think that's where the leverage is.
Thanks, Li-Chen. I've got a question for you. I want to ask you about oil and OPEC plus, but let me just ask a quick follow-up question and ask you for just a very quick answer. Have you been surprised that Russia's prestige has not suffered more because of its performance in the Ukraine?
Well, coming from where I sit, or where I usually sit in the Gulf, there have been some memes, some memes and political cartoons, which have sort of like have seen Putin's status being diminished slightly. That there have been some of these memes, but I think most of the opinion is that he's still in the fight. They're still sticking there despite, the many thousands of deaths and everything. So I think there's still that idea that, wow, Russia is still toughing it out. And so that it hasn't been really horribly damaged. The only thing that I think that has been damaged is the military. The military has been, I think, the most damaged. And I think that the military has been, 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 the mil Yes, pictures of, the Russian tanks and in flames and with Ukrainian tractors pulling them, that's been, I think, a bit of a surprise. But I think that the idea is, well, let's wait and see, right? Can the Americans in particular and the Europeans continue to supply the Ukrainians, for example? So I think there's a lot of a wait and see. In the first place, it's the Americans and Europeans helping them. Let's see how far that aid goes, and then we'll see what happens.
Thank you.
Can I have a two-finger comment?
Please jump in, Anna.
Thank you. If I may, just want to pick up on some very important points that Li-Chen just made. First, with regard to Russian weaponry, yes, it's very important to understand that there's short-term and long-term, right? And depending on whether or not sanctions against the Russian military-industrial complex will stay in place for a lengthy period of time, and we don't fully know that, right? If that were to happen, that would absolutely hamper Russia's ability to sell arms to the region. Also, we have to separate tanks and other types of Russian weaponry, like AK-47s, for example, because one of the things that happened with the war in Ukraine, which was very interesting to observe analytically, is that Twitter and other forms of social media often tended to exaggerate the situation on the battlefield ironically enough, in Ukraine's favor. And while from an information and narrative perspective, it's clear that Ukraine had won that battle as of now, ironically, it presented a slightly skewed picture. If you look deeper analytically, again, beyond Twitter feeds, the fact of the matter is Ukrainian tactical wins on the battlefield ultimately didn't translate into bigger victories. The fact of the matter is, if you look at how much territory Russia controlled before the war in Ukraine, and now it controls significantly more, right? I think it controlled about 7%. Now it's about 20%, if not more. If you look at also how Ukrainians ultimately gained territory, it wasn't through battlefield victories. And that's an important point to keep in mind as well, right? Because it's one thing to gain territory if troops retreat. Now, of course, the counterpoint to that is they retreated because they understood that their resources were better used elsewhere. So that is a loss in and of itself. But until you face someone on the battlefield and win, and you can show that's a very different type of dynamic. And also when it comes to, I guess, again, the battlefield in Ukraine, what we're back at seeing for weeks now is traditional Russian strength, and that is artillery. And Russia has a lot of artillery. So that adds to a very complex picture. And I think analytically, anybody who looks at this in detail can see that.
Thank you, Anna. Li-Chen, I wanted to ask you a question about oil. You mentioned it a little bit in your opening remarks. Do you assess that Russia remains today a influential sort of leader, the plus really of OPEC plus, retains its decision-making role with the Saudis in OPEC plus? And also, if you would just maybe interpret for us, I think there was a OPEC plus meeting yesterday, and factor that into your answer.
Sure, Bill. So I think yesterday's meeting was quite a good illustration of how Russia, I think, in my opinion, will continue to have influence as the plus within OPEC plus. So at yesterday's meeting, OPEC plus only agreed to increase output by 100,000 barrels per day, which is nothing. If you think that in the past few months, they agreed to increase it in total by about 600,000 in July and August. So 100,000 is a drop in a barrel, right? And it's the lowest increase ever in OPEC's history since quotas were introduced in the early 1980s. So that just gives you a sense as to how small in the entire context that is.
Wow.
Now, and the question is, why did they do that, right? How important was it to keep Russia on site? And I think that increase, that small increase, meant that they actually wanted to keep Russia on site, because they could have increased by, let's say, much more, like 400,000, as in the previous months. They could have done that. But I think that would have signaled to other OPEC plus members that, they could all increase their production at Russia's expense because there was now more room for them to produce and sell at Russia's expense. So I think that would have, annoyed Russia a little bit if that increment had been of a very significant margin. But at the same time, I think that the Gulf states in particular wanted to at least show a nod, right, a small nod, albeit, to Biden for his visit to the Gulf. I know that most analysts have said that this was a slap in Biden's face because of his visit to the Middle East, but I actually think that they could have just kept the same. They just could have kept the quota the same. They didn't have to increase output. That would have been a bigger slap. But increasing it by 100,000 barrels, I think, was a small concession to Biden that, okay, at least, that here, have a little bit, but not enough to just torpedo the entire OPEC plus unity with Russia. So yes, I think that Saudis, Emiratis, the major players in OPEC plus still think of Russia as really important to OPEC plus because, let's face it, the oil cycle goes up and down. You have high oil prices. It's always followed by a bust. And the Saudis are long-term thinkers, and they will think that when the bust actually comes, and it will come, they will need Russia on their side in order to implement production cuts. So yes, in the short term, there is a pain of, Russian oil competing with their oil in Asia, but that's just a short-term pain. In the long term, they are going to need Russia still to be on their side to manage markets. So yes, and the short answer to your question is, yes, I think Russia will still be a key part of OPEC plus going forward.
Thank you, Li-Chen. Anna, I wanted to move into the issue of Syria just a little bit with you. Russia got a significant boost in regional prestige from its military intervention that began in 2015. It got points, as I could and others have seen from talking with officials out in the region. It got points for the decisiveness of its intervention, for standing by an ally in a difficult situation, for its modern weaponry. And even, I think, although it wasn't articulated always, it got points for its willingness to use brute force to get results. They might not have gone along with every aspect of it, but there is a certain respect out in the region for a strong leader who demonstrates his power. Do you think that and we've talked about it a little bit, but I'd like you to maybe elaborate on it in the context of Syria. Has the Ukraine operation damaged the prestige that Russia got from its Syria intervention?
Yeah, I think as of now, the short answer is no, probably not. And that has to do with the fact that actually the points that you've already made, the almost begrudged sometimes respect that Russia won for basically for saying little but doing what they said they were going to do, right? Which is that we talked at length with flowery language about how Assad must go, but Putin said very little and made sure that Assad stays. If you looked at how the Russian military behaved in Syria after the Ukraine intervention, well, actually, right, even in the run-up to the Ukrainian intervention, to the invasion, Shoigu specifically went to Syria, and the Russian Navy held drills on the Eastern Mediterranean. And after the war started, well, by and large, Russian posture had not changed in a meaningful way. There were a lot of reports that were fairly superficial about troops moving. There were predictions that Russia was going to leave Syria. What in reality had happened is there was some tactical repositioning on the ground with Wagner, with the military police. But by and large, on average, Russia flew about the same number of sorties. At certain points, even at certain times in June, for example, if anything, Russian forces grew even a little bit more aggressive towards American forces on the ground. If you think about it, why that is, because Syria is such a strategically vital point for the Russian state. It allows power projection into multiple directions, and it directly impacts the war in Ukraine, right? it would be one of the last places that Russia would want to give up. And in fact, senior Russian officials, including Lavrentiev, Putin's special envoy to the region, highlighted that Russian position on Syria has not changed. And I think in terms of influence, perhaps the most important point to highlight as of now is that the UN Security Council once again caved into Russian language of the latest resolution on cross-border aid in Syria. The latest iteration basically took exactly what Russia wanted.
Right. They have a lot of leverage on that particular issue right now. Just a quick follow-up, Anna. Do you think that the Ukraine situation has made another, I know we don't know the future, but just in terms of, use it as an opportunity to talk about relationship dynamics between Putin and President Erdogan. Has the Ukraine offensive made another Turkish offensive in northern Syria more likely?
I think the answer, the short answer is probably maybe, because it is true that Russia has been careful now with the war in Ukraine to preserve its gains without overextension. And it does, to some extent, put Russia arguably in a little bit more of a vulnerable position. But at the same time, the fact of the matter is Turkey periodically wants to have these incursions one way or the other. So if you look at the entire context of the war, Erdogan is always, there were always these periodic attempts of Erdogan either to have an offensive or to in fact go on with an offensive. They would basically just put a Band-Aid on the problem and then just return to it again. So I think it's kind of a nuanced picture, but ultimately one way or the other, this was going to happen.
Thanks, Anna. Alex, I have a question for you also. I want to follow up on Syria, but first, I wonder if you'd sort of set the stage for us and describe your assessment of Israeli-Russian relations prior to the Ukraine action, and also give us just a quick sense of, in the last 5 months since the invasion, how has that relationship evolved? And then I'll ask you a little something about Syria.
Yes, thank you. As I suppose that Russia recognizes that Israel is one of the strongest states in the Middle East, and it just must take this fact into consideration. And also, I think that it is not a secret that Russia and Iran have different vision how the Middle East should look right now or in future, because Russia is mostly a secular country and Iran, as we know, not. They advance different values. Russia and Iran also struggle for influence in Syria and us. And this, I think, one of the reasons why Russia enables Israel to attack Iranian and its proxies in Syria. I think this is absolutely obvious. The hell with Israel, Russia strives to weaken Iranian positions in Syria. So this was the basic for cooperation between Russia and Israel. I think that Russia also recognizes the Israeli military interest and security interest in Syria, and Russian leadership, I suppose, recognize the fact that if Israel will see that its security indeed in danger, it will attack Syria, and Russia wants to prevent this situation. So because of this reason, Russia strives to preserve some balance between Israel and Iran in Syria. So,
and in terms of the 5 months since the invasion, has the relationship between Russia and Israel changed significantly?
I think that relationship was not changed significantly, but we can see some deterioration. First of all, because Israel anyway, in some way supports West sanctions and in some way supports Ukraine. Another case, I think that Russia anyway gradually lose its position in Syria. I mean that Russia was forced to take some forces from Syria and send to Ukraine, and in some time, I think that a balance of power and balance of interests between Iran and Russia is changing because of Russian very poor performance in Ukraine. Iran is strengthening in this competition between Russia and Iran and Syria. So I think due to these circumstances, Russia will face some weakening in Syria, while Iran will intensify its involvement, and as a result, Israel will be forced to strike more in Syria, and this will definitely cause the deterioration between Russia and Israel, also because maybe Russia will be forced, because of the situation in Ukraine, supports more Iranians and destroy this balance between Israel and Iran in Syria.
A related question, Alex. Do you have a sense that Israel's margin for action in Syria against Iranian and Hezbollah assets is more limited now because of Ukraine, or has it had?
No, it's continued in the same way. Anyway, I think despite all these talks from the Russian side, Russia, especially now, is not enabled to do something very active against Israel. Russian capabilities is very limited, especially here, and especially from military perspective. And I think that Russia just doesn't have resources for additional conflict in the Middle East. So Israel will continue to do what it did in the past.
Thank you, Alex. Anna, in your book, Putin's War, you argue that the U.S. and the West in general had a failure of imagination, and it tended to overemphasize the costs and the risk to Russia of the Syria intervention, and in a like-minded way failed to take into account Russia's enduring concerns with its sort of geography, its southern flank, including the Middle East. Do you think that the West is also getting the Ukraine wrong in similar ways that will damage Western influence and heighten or protect Russian influence in the Middle East?
Well, I think in some ways, the West is getting Ukraine wrong. One way, I think one way to look at it is that Putin's overall global goals, because again, as we talked earlier, there's the aspect of Ukraine itself, which is of course the invasion, but there's a global dimension, and that is Putin's attempt to reshape the US-led global order. That's why Russian officials routinely decry the rules-based global order that they feel has disadvantaged Russia. One thing you saw from the very beginning is the complete failure of the United Nations, which is an institution that is a central pillar of the rules-based global order, to act in its intended purpose, and that is to prevent a war of this scale. And that is a significant, at least from a prestige perspective, factor to consider. The second is that on the one hand, when it came to Ukraine, again, it was a more of a nuanced picture, because certainly the West took the invasion very seriously and rushed to help Ukraine. If anything, NATO now has 2 more members. But at the same time, the West was also largely reactive. If you look at Putin's aims in Ukraine, it's pretty clear that that the Kremlin, basically Russian ruling elites, not just Putin alone, are looking to destroy the idea of Ukraine as a country, as a state, and as an idea. And that is I mean, it's hard to overemphasize just how incredibly dangerous that is. But the West always tends to be risk averse. We wait for Russia to act first. We don't want to escalate too much. We worry about how our actions will be perceived by Russia as escalatory. And then in response, Russia just escalates more. And I think that dynamic of behavior, that pattern of behavior, is also on the display for the Middle East to see. And that contributes to this kind of a gray picture that we talked about earlier about how we don't know how the war is going to end. And Russia is trotting on despite the losses. Ukraine is also experiencing very heavy losses. We talked about Russian losses, but Ukraine is devastated. And so because of our, I would say again, risk aversion, and a certain failure of imagination, I do think that it contributes to perhaps what might surprise us as, why Russia's prestige has not declined as much in the region. But if we look at that picture, it's a little bit more understandable.
Thank you, Anna. Li-Chen, can we move and just consider for a second Iran? We've touched on it a bit tangentially here and there, but I wonder if you would assess Putin's recent visit to Tehran. And do you sense that Putin and Russia are being forced to draw closer to Iran in ways that might alarm the Gulf, or is that relationship already baked into the cake and it's not alarming them?
It's a great question. I think I would like to jump off from what Alex mentioned earlier. Please. about Turkey, about how Russia wants to kind of encourage Turkey not to make extra incursions into Syria while Russia is busy in Ukraine, so that Russia can hold on to what it has in Syria. And I think by that same token, that was one of the reasons, or one of the hoped for outcomes of Putin's visit to Russia, was to try to encourage Iran, to desist from actually filling in any vacuum that Russia would leave behind in Syria, because it's reorganizing its forces in Ukraine. So I think that was one thing that Russia was quite concerned to do. The other was, of course, to signal, this was, I think, one of the rare trips that Putin actually has made outside of Russia for the past few years. And so I think coming on top of Biden's visit to the Gulf, I think that was to signal that, hey, Russia is still here. We are visible, and we need to be visible. We are still credible. We are still actors here. And I think that was, a very strong signal, if you like, for the, outcast Inc., to be seen to be standing together, that Russia has choices despite the sanctions, etc. But I also think that there could be limited gains from Putin's trip to Iran, basically because Russia and Iran are still competitors on the oil market. I mean, say what you want. Yes, Iran can share with Russia the experience of gray trades on the oil market, ship-to-ship transfers in the middle of the ocean, that kind of thing. But at the same time, they are also very keen competitors in the Asian market, for example, in the Chinese market. So that's one element. A second reason why I think that the Putin's visit will have not that much impact is that Russia is not going to want to import too much from Iran. It's going to want to emphasize domestic substitution, producing things themselves rather than to buy it, let's say, from Iran or some other source that's willing to supply stuff to Russia, except for stuff that Russia can't make themselves. So I think there's going to be limited room for extra trade. And do I think that the Gulf states are annoyed with this trip? How does it feed into the Gulf calculation? Well, I think for the UAE, they don't object to it. In fact, they will probably welcome it because it aligns with their own policy of outreach to Iran. In recent months, for example, the UAE's very high-profile royal Sheikh Tahnoon has actually led a delegation of businessmen to Iran, I think it was in December 2021, and he's very close to Mohammed bin Zayed. So that's one indication that the UAE wants to kind of like bridge the gap with Iran. UAE is interested in sending ambassador back to Tehran, and so is Kuwait, by the way. So I think that, and of course, Anwar Gargash has talked a lot about de-escalation, that we have to de-escalate tension. So I think what Russia is doing with Iran kind of fits into that kind of a strategy. So I don't think that, at least the UAE won't be too upset. For Saudis, it's a bit different. They are, less aligned on the Iranian policy. But I think eventually they would like to get there too, because Saudi Arabia's projects, its grand projects, NEOM, etc., relies on some kind of regional peace. So I think the Gulf states will not be too perturbed.
Thanks, Li-Chen. I'm going to start weaving in some questions from the audience. I have one probably would be for you, and it gives you also a chance maybe to speak a little about the issue of food security. But we have a question from our audience about Russia's influence in Egypt, and specifically the trade of grain and wheat. How has that impacted Egypt's negotiating leverage with Russia?
Excellent question. So when I mentioned earlier that trade, wasn't high on the agenda in terms of Russia's indicator of Russia's influence, that's very true, except for food, right? With the exception of food, which is a huge category within trade, Russia has been quite influential in the foods, grains, right? Mm-hmm. So that would be things like wheat that for human consumption, or would be like corn or even barley for cattle consumption. So in terms of wheat, I think Egypt gets more than 60% of its wheat from Russia. So it is quite dependent, along with like Turkey and Sudan. So it's not the only dependent state, others are as well. And I think that would probably worry Egypt because of the impact on obviously inflation, impact on bread prices. Egypt's inflation this month was like 14.7%. Compared to something like 5.3% in June 2021. So the war in that sense has really inflated food prices. Will the war increase Egypt's leverage for Russia? Well, I think that in one sense, what the hope is that the Gulf states are kind of bailing out Egypt. Egypt's having all kinds of difficulties, and so the Gulf states have chipped in the form of cash or in the form of investments, a total of around $22 billion US. And so I think that will help solve, or not solve, but mitigate some of Egypt's immediate problems. But I'm not sure that is going to solve Egypt's problems in terms of food. And not just in terms of food, but also in terms of, say, building the reactors. Russia is building reactors in Egypt, and they've just started construction of the first reactor. And I am, not sure that with the sanctions, especially on Russian banks, the Rosatom, which is the Russian nuclear agency, is not being sanctioned itself. But some of its finances, let's say the banks they are under sanction. And so this could, have difficulties in completing those projects in Egypt. So I think that this war is going to actually put some question mark over Russian influence in Egypt, as well as the point about arms sales that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Li-Chen. We have a question from our audience from Shmuel Yerushalmi. And his question deals with the Ukraine crisis and whether it will serve to bring Russia more actively into a role in the Middle East, for example, with the Iranian set of issues, or with the Palestinian issue with Israel. I wonder, Alex, if you have any comments on that, or possibly Anna?
Yes, I think that, as I said previously, Russia now very busy with Ukraine and doesn't have additional resources for intervention here in Middle East, from my point of view, at least from a military point of view. Politically, they can try to do, I mean to speak, but they do not.
And I think that's what he means is politically, I believe, is the role he's talking about.
Politically, no, I don't think that Russian resources now are very limited. I think the answer is no. And about the previous question, Egypt buys from Russia about indeed 60% of grains and additional 25% from Ukraine, but this was previous year.
Mm-hmm. Anna, did you have anything you wanted to say about Russia's possible increase in possible political roles in the Middle East?
Yeah, perhaps not necessarily increase, but also not necessarily a decrease either, because if you look at the Iran deal negotiations, Russia retains a role in the P5+1 group. Mm-hmm. And what's illustrative is that even despite the invasion of Ukraine and basically the breaking so many international norms with the act of this invasion, Russia remained a partner to the West in these negotiations. Now we don't really know when where exactly these negotiations are headed. The news has been sort of all over the place in that regard. Mm-hmm. But that is an important point to keep in mind, especially it goes to the issue of whether or not Russia is entirely isolated, and its participation in these talks shows that it's not.
Got it. We also have a question from the audience that compares which factor is more important to Russia's current position in the Middle East and its influence. Is it Russian performance in the Ukraine, or is it American hesitation in dealing, I think the question means both in countering Russian efforts in the Ukraine, but also in its stance towards the Middle East overall, and this idea that the U.S. is changing its security posture and maybe looking to pivot somewhere else in towards Asia and has less interest in security. Any sense about that, Li-Chen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really a combination, right? They have the Gulf states at least have a sense that America is having new priorities or changing its priorities. I don't necessarily agree that that's actually the case on the ground, but that's the perception. As Anna said, perception is everything, right? So, and that's the perception that we have here, and they work with that perception that America has changed its priorities. And hence the Gulf states need to look for new partners, whether that's Russia, whether that's France, and France has been quite active in the past few days or past few weeks in the UAE, or whether that's China, which has been again very active in the Gulf and in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE. China even offering to, I think, build like drones or something. And so, this is just part of a security diversification. But I don't believe that if given the choice, the Gulf states would choose others over the US. I think for them, Russia kind of serves as what you mentioned earlier, kind of a bargaining chip, a kind of a signaling function. And so that's quite useful to have. I'll give you a concrete example of the Sukhois. Right, the UAE was really interested in buying the Russian-made Sukhoi 57s, I believe they're the combat aircraft, latest generation, and the deal was signed in 2017. And they kept, there came periodic announcements that we're going to start buying them or even producing part of it, with the UAE. But as the years pass by, nothing has happened. And of course, in tandem, the UAE has been wanting to buy American jets. And so, they kept waving this in front of the Americans. And so eventually, of course, they've got the jets apparently that they want, perhaps the F-35s in pipeline. And so I think this is one example where Russia does serve as quite a useful, bargaining chip. I'm not sure why. Maybe you could tell us why the Americans keep falling for this. But they do seem to be using that bargaining chip quite effectively.
Thank you, Li-Chen. Just to follow up, a part of his question also focused, and Alex talked a little bit about this, American missteps, that it isn't just Russia's performance that has been the key to its current maintaining its level of influence, but also U.S. has made, and the West have made mistakes and have hesitated in how to respond. I wonder about your perception of that, and also of this idea that some analysts have talked about, that there's actually a shared ideological vision in some ways about regional order between Russia and some countries in the Middle East. So it isn't just hedging behavior, but it's actually, there's a sense that there's a shared sense of regional order.
Yes, I do think that there's something to it in the sense of the shared regional order. They'd like it to be stable, rather than encouraging change or colored revolutions, that kind of thing. If there should be change, it would be change on the Gulf terms, like what happened with women and driving in Saudi Arabia. Change will have to come from the top. It's not from the grassroots level. So yes, I do think that they like this idea of stability, even of authoritarian stability. And there is that kind of a preference, but I think that if push comes to shove, right, despite American missteps, whether in Syria with Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, etc., despite these missteps, I think it's, or at least my view, that the Gulf will still choose the U.S. as the security guarantor, even despite Russia's offer of a Middle East collective Middle East plan. And why I say this is because if you look at, polling is not an exact science, but if you look at some of these polls and barometers, they do tend to show that the Arabs see China as the number one external, non-regional ally, right? And then followed by, let's say, Russia, and then France, and the US is somewhere down below. But if you desegregate the numbers, take out the numbers for the Arabs and break them into Gulf, Levant, and North Africa, you would actually find that the Gulf states are the one which are most, to see the US in the best light, compared to, say, the Levant or North Africa. So I think that that's why I'm, quite, at least it's my opinion, that the US still does have some good standing in the Gulf, and the Gulf would still continue to choose the US as a guarantor.
Thank you. Alex, any further comment on that general idea? You talked about it a little bit earlier about American mistakes and failure to use its influence correctly. Anything you want to add on that issue?
I agree that anyway, Arab countries, especially rich Arab countries, will choose United States as a major security provider, not Russia. Despite some mistakes. Indeed, sometimes the American government tries to conduct some kind of democratization. They do not take into account the local conditions. For example, if it will take, for example, Iraq as multi-ethnic country with very weak institutions. So in such country, very difficult to conduct democratization, even very dangerous. So I think that anyway, American government has studied some previous mistakes and may adjust to reality. It's willings or policies. So I think that democratization, for example, in Germany after the Second World War and in the Middle East should go in different ways. It's a very long process.
Okay, thank you, Alex. One other question from our audience. There's a question from Professor Mark Katz about Russian demand for its own weaponry because of the war. And is that going to decrease the ability of Russia to export weapons to the Middle East? And if it does, where will countries in the Middle East turn to, those countries that rely on Russian armaments for their defense capacity? Alex, you want to tackle that?
Yes, I think that the next suppliers will be China or maybe, yes, I think China, because United States or some European countries not always ready to supply weapons for everyone, of course, because of different issues of human rights violations, etc. So I think that China and maybe Turkey will receive these contracts instead of Russia.
Okay. I have a question from our president, Doug, Ambassador Silliman. He's wondering if one of the panelists can comment on recent post-Ukraine migration of wealthy and professional Russians to the Gulf, particularly Dubai. How permanent is this move? And will the UAE continue to provide such a safe haven for Russian assets and people, I guess? Li-Chen, that might be for you.
Sure. So I'm not sure about how permanent it is, but I think it's going to, continue for a while. Just like London had its share of, Russian oligarchs who lived in London. I think Dubai is the new hotspot for Russian and even Ukrainians who are fleeing the war, the rich Ukrainians who are fleeing the war. Obviously, you've seen reports on anecdotal stories of the yachts being parked there and apartments and houses and homes being snapped up at ridiculous prices by the Russians in particular. So I think this is something that the Gulf state, or at least the Gulf Emirate of Dubai, is not going to stop. It has housed previously quite a lot of political exiles from different parts of the world, different autocrats in Dubai. So I don't think they would shy away from being a haven for people who are fleeing wars or conflicts or in their mind persecution. So I think this practice will continue. The UAE will continue to house them. Obviously, they're going to come under some pressure from the West. I think they will come under pressure. You may know that the UAE is already on the gray list for not taking enough action in terms of anti-money laundering. They're on this gray list and for the first time. But they've very quickly taken actions to try to get off the gray list, although they are still on the gray list. But in this case of the Russians in Dubai, I don't think that they're going to take much action because, they are used to having, Iranians or other nationalities in Dubai. But if I can have the liberty of expanding that question to look at Russian tourists who go to Dubai, which is another aspect of that. The number of Russian tourists who've come to Dubai, they used to be one of the huge markets for Dubai. Something like even the top 3 markets or top 4 markets in the past few years pre-pandemic. But recent figures from January to May have shown a sharp drop in the number of Russians, something like a drop of about 30% in the number of Russians from January to May of this year compared to previous years. So I think that is something that is, that shows you the impact of the war because of the sanctions and the problems with bank transfers and payments and, capital controls. So that's the other side of the more of the people to people story rather than the, elites.
Thank you, Li-Chen. I have a question that I would like to ask each. So we're running towards the end of our time. And I have a question I'd like each of you to tackle and give your assessment and any concluding remarks you'd like to make. So one analyst I was reading has noted the following: Russia still has willing partners in the Middle East, and he assessed that there's a greater confluence of interests in the Gulf with Russia, for example, on oil production and desire for a multipolar world order, than there is with the US on regional security. So what about that? Each of you, I'll give you a chance to sort of conclude your remarks and take on this issue. I think it's relatively clear from things we've talked about, but I'd love to hear your answer. Does Russia still have willing partners out in the Middle East and in the Gulf in particular? And is there this confluence of interests that still remains that's greater than US interests? Alex, you want to start?
Yes, I can. I think that I agree with this statement only partially. I think the cooperation with Russia is rather situational and pragmatic for now. We will not know what we will be in 5 years from now. It's not a long-range strategy. Also, I think that Russia does not long-range strategy for the Middle East, and as I could see in the Russian foreign preferences, position of Middle East is relatively low, below Europe, Far East, etc. Also, we take into consideration that Russia is declining from different points of view, from economic, technological, military, and also demographic perspectives. Also, Russian capabilities to produce gas and oil will decline due to sanctions and different technological problems, which Russia may resolve only with help, with Western help. So also Russian weight inside the OPEC Plus will decline. So I think this cooperation between Russia and the Gulf countries is only situational and pragmatic, and depends on the relationships between the United States and the Gulf countries. If the United States will decide to improve these relations, so Russia will be forced to leave, or anyway, Russian weight will decline in the Middle East.
Thank you, Alex. Anna?
Sure. So I'd like to go back to my original point from the beginning, and that is that the region and all the rest of us really don't know how the war in Ukraine is going to end. And for that reason, we are in a period of a lot of uncertainty. And so I know the piece that you're referring to, I do think that Russia indeed has willing partners in the Middle East, in part, at the very least, because of this high degree of uncertainty. It also has to do with the fact that we're all facing a global recession. And certainly we can talk about Russia's decline. The fact of the matter is Russia was, for most of its existence, Russia was always kind of this contradictory, weak, great power that historian Stephen Kotkin described Russia in that way, and I think that's a very apt description. And so we've periodically seen Russia decline, in fact, for years, but it hadn't necessarily prevented its ability to act on the global arena. And also the points made earlier about shared visions of a multipolar world, aversion to perceived American sort of moralizing about human rights and so forth. These are all pieces of a complex picture that does, to me, suggest at this stage, Russia has willing partners in the Middle East. The key question is, if Russia were to fundamentally lose in Ukraine, I think that would change the calculus from the region, but it's too soon to tell right now.
Thank you, Anna. Li-Chen?
Yeah, I would echo what Anna said about maybe seeing what happens in Ukraine. But if I can add from the energy perspective, so even if let's say Russia loses big, as Anna put it, I still think that the Gulf states at least would find some value in keeping Russia on their side, even if Russian oil production will decline in the near future, as Alex mentioned, it will decline. It's kind of inevitable. It's offshore fields, difficult to get the oil and gas out of it, and with sanctions especially. So Russian oil production will decline. But if you think about the numbers, Russia will still be among the largest oil producers in the world. Even in the OPEC plus group, the next largest after Saudis and the Russians are the Iraqis at about maybe 4.6 million barrels of oil a day. And Russia is at about 11. So even if it loses 2 or 3 million from the sanctions that take place at the end of the year, that's still 8 million. And Iraqis is 4.6. So whatever happens, Russia will still be a huge energy producer, not just oil, but gas and coal. And so, I think that for that reason, OPEC will want to keep the Russians on site, even if they lose big.
That's actually a great point, Li-Chen, and I agree with you on that as well.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank our panelists today, as well as our co-hosts at the University of Haifa for our year-long collaboration with them. Thank each of you on the panel. Great set of insights. I think taking the discussion as a whole, you've offered a sort of, I would call it a nuanced corrective, maybe, about the situation in the Ukraine and how it is going to reshape the Russian influence in the Middle East. And you've also, I think, underscored 2 other fundamental points. One is that the situation is very uncertain and a lot rides on how it plays out. So it's a little caution is advisable here in predicting how its influence in the Middle East is going to look in the future. Thanks again to everyone. I look forward to seeing all of you, I hope, at our next AGSIW event. Thank you to the audience, and see you next time. Thank you.